You're listening to The Metro on 1019 WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Kerry Jr. II. It's been years since the COVID-19 pandemic forced office workers to set up shop in their homes. Companies have since adopted a mixture of in-person, hybrid, and remote work policies. It's an attempt to accommodate a radically different and changing working environment than the one that had existed 5+ years ago. As we get further from the pandemic, companies have been bringing their office workers back. At the beginning of September, Ford required employees to be in office 4 days a week. GM is moving its headquarters to the brand new Hudson site downtown. And at the same time, co-working spaces continue to be a popular workplace option for companies. This mix between new traditional office space, co-working space, and hybrid work has us wondering what the future of the workplace could look like. Melissa Fisher is an anthropologist whose work focuses on workplace culture and design. She joins me now to discuss this. Melissa, welcome to the Metro.
Delighted to be here, Kerry.
Delighted to have you. So, Melissa, you are an anthropologist, as I said in the intro. What does it mean to be an anthropologist who studies workplace culture?
That's a great question. Well, traditionally, anthropologists went to so-called exotic societies to study their culture, their behavior, the changes in their ideas, for example, going to Bali. But in the last couple of decades, anthropologists have turned their attention to looking at businesses and corporate structures and, in fact, the workplace. So as a workplace anthropologist, I look at workplace culture and changes in behavior, given all the changes that you just mentioned, right? Mm-hmm. AI, the rise of hybrid work and co-working. And we use a methodology called ethnography. Mm-hmm. We really try to understand the workplace from the point of view, the worldview of the employees who are experiencing those changes. So we talk to people, we observe people, we see the issues they're facing, the joys they experience, but also, with the rise of AI, the anxieties they have about the future of work and indeed their career prospects.
Yeah, let's pull on that thread a little bit. What are the issues in there? You've mentioned AI, we mentioned different workplace environments. What are the different things that we're facing right now in 2025?
I think in 2025, there are two things we're facing. First is we went from a moment 5 years ago, or nearly 5 years ago, with the immediate shutdown of the workplace, or at least for professional workers, certainly not for frontline workers, right, who had to open and take care of the buildings. But remote work became something that was a global phenomenon for the first time in history, really. Then we all had to begin to come back to the workplace, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, and so on and so forth. And we saw the sort of rise of hybrid working, right, where people were coming in part-time. Now we're in a moment as we emerge out of this COVID moment where we see leaders, for example, at JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, saying, look, folks, many of you belong in the workplace 5 days a week. You need to come back to the office. So there's been a kind of change. But hybrid work is here to stay. The evidence is clear. The second biggest phenomenon changing the workplace is, of course, the rise of AI. What is that going to do to jobs? What is that going to do to the skill set people need to bring to the job? But also let's think about not just AI for the professional workers, the knowledge workers, but robotics, right, changing factory work as well. So we've got a lot of moving pieces. And I'll just add that as an anthropologist, I'm really mostly interested in how do people interpret these changes? Mm-hmm. How do cultural ideas about work, success, failure, what it means to balance work and family, really shape how people understand what's going on when they go to work, wherever that might be.
And then what do you do with that information once you've collected it after hearing from workers?
Right. So that's a great question. So traditionally, anthropologists went ahead and they wrote a book, and they talked mostly to academics, not always. But in my case, I'm really interested in thinking about how can we use this information, this data. Usually it's qualitative data, the kind of ethnographic fieldwork interviews that I just talked about, but we usually combine it, right, with quantitative data, surveys, and so forth. And we want it to really inform workplace strategy and design, right? So for example, I recently did a project, a report with JLL, and we found that talking to folks that people are really facing what we called an omnipresent challenge, where they're always sort of on, right? They feel on 24 hours a day. So we were trying to help people to think about, firms and so forth, to think about what are the strategies that can be put into place, the policies, the practices to enable employees to flourish given those new conditions, right? We're not so used to always being on.
I see. And to clarify, JLL is a real estate company?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Got you.
Sorry about that.
No problem. So Melissa, I'm curious to know more about the specifics of what people are saying about their changing environment, what they like, what they dislike. In your work, you encourage healthy kind of work environments. What does an unhealthy work environment look like? What about the way our work may be structured now or have been structured in the past that we're trying to get away from?
Lots of things. And I think people really began to have a moment during COVID to rethink their priorities, to rethink, for example, a couple of things. One is the commute, right? Do I really want to commute? I mean, I live in New York City. Yesterday, I commuted probably 3 hours between the buses, the subway, and so forth. So the first was, how much time do I want to put in? What is the energy that I'm putting in? What is the cost into commuting? Maybe I want to spend part of the time at home if that's possible, given the kind of work I'm doing. The second is people really thought about, well, sometimes if I feel really comfortable, at home, right? I can go get coffee, I can walk the dog. I've got my really comfortable place where I've set up shop and I have a computer that I feel comfortable with. People began to really rethink the environment, I think a lot more about how the environment, whether that's sound or lighting or, soft colors, or literally the ability to take a break and get a breath of fresh air and recognize that, wow, I can actually work more productively and I feel happier about doing work. So I think we're in this moment of like rethinking about sort of what are the ways in which the environment, physical and digital, how does that really shape who we are? And I co-wrote an article in Work Design magazine about 6 months ago, really thinking about sort of how can anthropologists work with architects and interior designers to really understand what it is about lighting. How do we actually create a space where what we call positive friction or spontaneous interactions can take place in the workplace? What we used to call like the water cooler moment, right? Where you would suddenly bump into somebody and have some kind of interesting conversation or meet somebody who would be a mentor. And if people aren't coming into work 5 days a week, we really need to think about the policies, the practices, but also literally the physical design of the workplace to create those possibilities for people to have what we call incidental information, right? How you actually bump into somebody, they tell you something about an idea, and suddenly you've got something kind of boiling, right? Kind of bubbling. So it could be really simple, and I'll stop here, but it could be, for example, creating a staircase with a set of banisters with places where you can kind of easily put a coffee cup on, right? So you can kind of stop and sit down. I mean, it's like very kind of obvious things where people can, sort of begin to feel kind of comfortable, more informal in the workplace setting.
I want to settle on one of the points you made, which is the fact that when people are in the workplace, they bump into each other. Because my question to you was, if we have kind of discovered that, being outside and being in sunlight and places that are outside of the traditional workplace have been beneficial for us, why force people to go back if we know that that's been helpful? And it sounds like what you're saying is it's the collaboration that's important.
I think it's two things. It's the collaboration, but it's the sense of being part of a community, part of being a unifying culture, right? And I think what happened during COVID, people felt very dislocated, very lonely, kind of far away, obviously physically from people and digitally. And so I think people have found a really significant importance about being back with their colleagues, presuming they like them reasonably well,
Yeah.
that it's not just only about the opportunities to collaborate, but also literally socializing. And it's these sort of, not just the formal meetings and the formal way of working, but it's also what anthropologists talk about, the informal moments, right? The informal ways of working, right? The way in which that, you always go to a big meeting with a departmental meeting, but you've got your best friend and colleague, and you always go out for coffee afterwards and you debrief, right? And then you come up with an idea and a strategy about an idea or how to deal with a bad boss. It's those kind of moments which are, at the moment at least, and things are changing with new kinds of technologies, I think it's those kind of moments that people really desire and have recognized that it's worthwhile to come into the office, right? It's worthwhile for those connections, those relationships, solidifying them, having those conversations that can be leveraged to be more productive, but also just to feel genuinely more connected to people.
What about the people who want to keep their personal lives and their connections and all of their sentimental feelings separate from the workplace, where they just want to be at work to do the job? They work with their colleagues enough to get the job done, and then they go home.
Well, I mean, that's completely reasonable. Not everybody feels like sharing or being kind of like kumbaya, right? I mean, I think that hybrid working is perhaps the best model in my estimation, where you have a combination of, going in and being present and perhaps, working whether you feel comfortable or not because you need to get a job done, but also having those days or those hours where you're working at home and you just feel like you can have your more private life. You can balance the family. Let's say it's a dad and he's taking care of a newborn where his wife is out working or something like that. You feel that you have, as an employee, agency, which I think anthropologists talk a lot about. People want to feel like they have agency and control over their lives, right? And over how much they do want to share or not share or have some kind of demarcation, a line, a boundary between public and private life or work and family life. So to me, hybrid is the obvious model to allow people both to feel more comfortable, but also to allow businesses to feel that they are getting enough right from their employees who are able to do the work at hand. We've got to find a kind of sweet spot between what employees generally want and how leaders are feeling. And there's often sometimes a big disconnect at the moment, and trying to weave together a way so that they can meet in a more optimal fashion, a more optimal structure, I think is what an anthropologist who goes into the workplace, not only to understand the different ways people feel about work, but to come up with workplace strategies, ideas for design, ways of creating more cohesive culture where people feel that their values align more with the corporation and that there's not such a disconnect. That's what anthropologists like myself are hired to do.
You're listening to The Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Carrie Jr. II. My guest is Melissa Fisher. She's an anthropologist and is focused on workplace culture and design. We're discussing the future of work as we shift further into in-person work, hybrid work. We're trying to figure out what type of work we're going to do in the future. So, Melissa, you just mentioned companies' goals, trying to make sure that they're aligned with the employee. I'm wondering what that means necessarily from the company's perspective. We've talked about the benefits of the employee. What if the company doesn't have a main mission that has, I guess, broader employee or workplace wellness or a healthy work environment as part of their main goals? How do you establish that, I guess?
Well, I mean, I think that is happening. I mean, there are companies that are doing these things really well, and there are companies that are not doing these things really well. I think that some leaders feel very adamant about having people back 5 days a week and may or may not be so concerned about company wellness or employee wellness. And I think what we've got to do is have people understand the different ways that people are experiencing and understanding work and their needs. And the best leaders are kind of empathetic, right? They have a sense not only of their own position, which is at the top of the corporate hierarchy, but hopefully, and often as an anthropologist, our job is to enable these conversations to happen between leaders and employees so that they have a much more bigger understanding and not such a gap. But if they can have empathy for employees all the way up and down the corporate hierarchy, I'm talking about like what happens to the janitor, what happens to the secretary, right? what happens to the people who are moving up the corporate ladder, then I think it behooves them, right, to understand the needs. Now, that doesn't mean that they will be able to give everything to an employee, right? That's not part of what their mission may necessarily be. But I think that empathy for employees is something that's a characteristic of the best leaders that we have today.
Are you talking with bosses and supervisors? It seems like the management class wanted a return to office before like the everyday office worker wanted it. What are they saying about that? And what are they saying about kind of what you just mentioned as well, like understanding their perspective, understanding the worker's perspective?
Well, I mean, I am talking to a range of people all the way up and down the corporate hierarchy because an anthropologist, I think it's really it's important to understand a corporation or a business or an organization as a cohesive system made up of employees that are all the way throughout a hierarchy. I think that it's important to talk to leaders to perhaps have them understand better the ways in which somebody much more further down the totem pole understands and what their needs are. But it's also important to have conversations that are led between leaders and employees. So one of my jobs is to talk to leaders and to talk to employees and to translate what each needs and to come up with a set of prescriptions, a set of strategies or policies that I think will work for the entire cultural, social system of work. That will make sense to a leader, but would also make sense to their employees. And that takes a lot of work, right? Because that requires the anthropologist to understand people in various distributed ways in which they're working, but also to be part of a translator. So leaders need to understand what employees want and feel, but employees also need to understand the leader's position. So can we come to a kind of common understanding? I don't think that's going to be perfect. But one of the things we can do is sort of have more kinds of communication, more communication channels in which people develop a better understanding and perhaps can come up with a reasonable middle, right? I'm not saying that employees will be perfectly happy or perhaps leaders would be perfectly happy, but let's see what we can create that works well for everyone. And then let's think about the relationship to ROI, right? Because leaders are concerned with, obviously, and for good reason, profitability, return on investment. So the thing is I think we need to understand better that how employees experience work, how they act at work, the environment, giving wellness is not just a perk, it's not just a luxury, it's not just an amenity, right? This can really contribute, these kinds of attributes to a workplace can enable somebody to perform better. And if we understand that, and we create new metrics, right? Not just short-term metrics of output, quarterly, but on a longer term. And we begin to see that innovation is higher in these in specific workplaces. Then I think it's reasonable for leaders to say, hey, let's take a serious look, because I see that there's a relationship between what we think are the soft, the fuzzy things, the luxury things, the kind of things that employees want, and what I'm seeing for my return on investment. And we're not quite there yet in all spaces, but that's where I think we should be heading.
I see. Now, earlier you mentioned the benefit of coming back to work, of workers going back to the office because they have collaboration, mentorship, all that kind of stuff. What are supervisors and managers saying they believe the benefits are? Because from what I understood, I thought that was from the worker's perspective. This is what a worker benefits from when they go back to work. Are supervisors and bosses who make the decision to return back to the office thinking of those same benefits? Or are there other things that they want that are priorities for them?
Well, I mean, they're obviously, responsible, right, for a team or a department. I mean, they have a whole set of challenges, right, and stresses on them, right? And they're closer to sort of thinking about what they need to do for the bottom line. But they need to be thinking about how can I orchestrate or how can I ensure that the collaboration and the work that I'm seeing with my department, whether it's 5 people, 10 people, or 15, that people are really working collaboratively, both when they're coming into the office, but also in a distributed manner, right? So that's really the key, right? How can we ensure that people who are in the office, out of the office, potentially if they're out of the office or even in the office and somebody's working from Detroit with somebody in New York, with somebody in London and Singapore, I mean, we have to think about what are the tools what are the technologies that enable that collaboration to happen, wherever that is, right? Whether it's actually physically in the office or in a distributed way or some kind of hybrid formation.
I see. One thing I want to ask is about the third space here. I know that you've written about how how companies are trying to incorporate a third space within the office and work culture. How does that really work? Because when I first hear that, and when people first hear that, they think of a third space as somewhere outside of work.
Sure. So there's a little bit of a differentiation, and Hannah Costin, my co-author, and I wrote about this in our work design article. The third place is often like the physical place, and that's been traditionally the place that's neither work nor home, right? Like a coffee shop, right? That's a kind of physical space. But another theorist, Homi Bhabha, wrote about what he called the third space. There's a little bit of a difference here, right? The third space is that mental space where people, or that kind of in digital space where people and ideas are kind of flowing and coming together in ways. So there's a little bit of a difference. And what we want, whether it's a third place or a third space, is the opportunity for different people to come together who might not come together in an ordinary way and interact with each other, to engage in what I call positive friction, right? Sort of to have people who are from, one department, from one company that's doing something for technology, and another person from another company that's doing a startup. And it happens that they're meeting at the coffee hub in a co-working space, and they start to talk about something and collaboration begins to happen. And sort of like it's an effervescent, right? It's a kind of social effervescence where people come and create new ideas in these kind of third places. And so what companies have begun to realize is that we don't just want to have the so-called coffee shop, which is kind of, or the co-working spaces that we traditionally and that have flourished, right? But let's build them internally. Let's incorporate them into the office environment, into the physical workplace.
I see. All right, Melissa, we are actually out of time. We've got to move on. There's so much more I feel like to unpack here that I wanted to get to, but we do thank you for joining us on the Metro.
Delighted to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. Melissa Fisher is an anthropologist, and her work focuses on workplace culture and design. Coming up, is the Masonic Temple haunted? We'll get the answer next.